Please take a moment to read Colonel Leonard's short biography in your program, listing his many military decorations, and I'm sure you'll agree, we are in the presence of an American hero. Here to share his thoughts on patriotism and service, again, it is my great honor and privilege. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Edward Leonard.
Thank you very much. There are one or two places in this speech where I tend to get kind of emotion. And after hearing Johnny sing, God Bless America, and the pastor's comments, well, I hope I don't choke up. It was very stirring, and I thank you very, very much. My wife's great-grandfather was committed to battle in the cornfield on the morning of September 17th. He and over 22,000 other men were casualties on that day. Antietam was a day that America's earth ran red. It was in the year 1862. A year later, Suzanne's other great-grandfather, who was in the 20th Maine at Gettysburg, he made that bayonet charge from Little Round Top alongside Joshua Chamberlain. As a boy, I used to love to hear my family talk of the welcome my Uncle Theodore received when he returned to Winlock from World War I. His younger brother, my Uncle Herb, must have worn Theodore's souvenir gas mask until it dropped off his face. I was 8 years old when Uncle Herb's son, Dean, returned from World War II. His brother, my cousin Clark, and I stood on the curb and watched him ride through Winlock, our hometown. And I was so proud I could scarcely draw a breath. It was 1946. I was 13 when my cousin Clark returned from Korea. Wounded at Christmas Ridge and returned to battle, he was wounded again at Heartbreak Ridge and once more returned to his unit. On the very last day of fighting in Korea, he received his third Purple Heart at a place called Pork Chop Hill. I stood beside my cousin Dean, Clark's brother, as Clark rode into Winlock. I was so proud I could scarcely draw a breath. It was 1954. I came home from Vietnam after 5 years as a prisoner of war. Riding in a convertible, I saw my cousins, Dean and Clark, standing at the curb, and I nearly lost it. My nephew's son, Cody, returned from Iraq last week, and that party is going to go down in family myth and legend. It was the biggest party to date. The Vancouver police were called out 2 nights in a row, and each time they shook Cody's hand and welcomed him home. There were 25 yard bags of trash sitting next to the garbage can at the next pickup later that week. Each generation of American must relearn on a very personal level that life is a profound and passionate thing. Our freedoms cannot be given to us. Each generation must secure its own. See, all wars are ultimately about the national character, that elusive sum of character of the individuals who fought those battles. And our veterans have given us the opportunity to secure freedom for ourselves. We each must share the passion of our time, at the peril of being judged never to have lived. Pity those who stood aside when the call comes to commit themselves to something beyond their own narrow self-interest. Those who, as Shakespeare's Henry V said, stayed abed in England on Crispin's Day. Paul Montague was killed on March 29, 1968 in Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. It was during the Tet Offensive. Intense, accurate fire savagely shredded his helicopter as he flew a Marine combat team behind enemy lines. He cleared the area, but crashed in the next valley. The combat team clawed out of the twisted wreckage, took one look at the blood-smeared pilots hanging dead in their harnesses, and they took off, followed by some very upset North Vietnamese infantry. In Anthony, Kansas, a Marine Honor Guard presented Paul's wife, Shirley, with an American flag on behalf of a grateful nation. 3 days after ejecting, I was captured by a badly mauled North Vietnamese division moving out of South Vietnam through Laos following their defeat during the Tet Offensive. Now, this was a problem. You see, Ho Chi Minh's army was not in Laos. He said so. And the United States Air Force wasn't bombing Laos either. We said so. So I was an embarrassment to both governments. That is not a comfortable place to be. After initial interrogations, I was force marched each night through bomb jungle. At last, I was herded into a cave where I spent the day. At dusk, I was put on a truck and lashed to the bed. The truck would jar and bumble and roll side to side, fore and aft, up and down, like a repetitiously interrupted corkscrew stumbling through the night. Periodically, the truck would stop on the edge of a village. I'd be offloaded, my arms bound behind my back, and I'd be pulled by a noose about my neck through the village, through an inevitable gauntlet of very angry villagers armed with clubs and jabbing sticks, rocks, all whipped to a frenzy by a small band of political organizers. Through the village, I'd be put back on the truck, and again we'd stumble and bumble through the night into the morning, at last coming to a halt several hundred yards off the road under trees and camouflage netting. Near sundown every evening, the truck started again on another bone-jarring trek over rough, bombed-out roads along rocky stream beds. After a week, I was offloaded and marched several miles across rice paddies to a jungled rise. Under the tree canopies were bamboo cages containing American servicemen and civilians, a number of Canadians, and a German nurse. I was placed in a bamboo cage well removed from the others. The second evening in camp, the other prisoners were taken out of their cages and they disappeared down into the jungle. And shortly after, 2 guards opened my cage and motioned me to come out. I was led down the same trail and emerged from the jungle on the edge of a large open field. There was a small creek meandering to one side, and I could see the others bathing in it. My guard stopped me a short distance upstream from the others and indicated I was to wash. The muddy water was waist deep and wonderfully, luxuriously warm. Now, the sun had been down for a little bit, but you could still see just a magnificent display of red and orange on the horizon. Even the guards were staring at it. And I heard the gurgle of some water, and I turned and looked. And I swear a walrus head came out of that water. And as I looked at it, the walrus spoke to me. The walrus said, "I'm Captain Paul Montague, U.S. Marine Corps. I'm the senior ranking officer. Who are you?" "I'm Ed Leonard, Captain, U.S. Air Force." He said, "What's your date of rank?" I said, "It's December 1964. And as his head sunk back into the murk, I heard him say, "Now you're the senior ranking officer, you poor son of a bitch." And my friends, that was my change of command ceremony. Paul would have been very, very distressed to learn that he'd been killed in action. Some years before Vietnam, he'd returned home from an unaccompanied tour in Korea. He'd arrived during the school year and had a wonderful reunion with his family. On Monday morning, Pam, his 6-year-old daughter, asked him to meet her after school. When he arrived at the schoolyard, Pam appeared accompanied by several of her little friends. And when she spotted her dad, she tossed her head triumphantly, marched directly toward him. And as she arrived right in front of him, she stopped, she spun around, put her little fists on her hips, and half shouted at the other children, "You see, I do too have a daddy." Imagine listening to a ragged, starved scarecrow of a man sitting in the gloom of a prison telling this 10-year-old story about his daughter. It is perhaps in the ordination of providence that we are taught the value of our liberties by the price our veterans and their families pay for those freedoms. In the jungle prison camps of Laos, I served with ordinary men and women captured in battle, ordinary, magnificent women and men from all walks of life. People you would pass on the street and never even notice. But your life is somehow the poorer for never having known them. A Kansas farmer, an accountant, electrician, a pig expert from the University of Oregon, 3 nurses serving at a Christian relief organization that was overrun. You see, you cannot stand up day after day to a never-ending series of indecisive contests where victory is impossible and defeat is unacceptable. You endure these, and you finally achieve brotherhood. Sergeant Dennis Thompson, now retired and living in Olympia, was a member of the Special Forces A-Team defending the Long Bay Special Forces camp between Khe Sanh and the Laotian border. At the height of the Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese Army overwhelmed the camp using 4 Russian tanks, the first Soviet tanks seen in the South. And Long Bay had no anti-tank weapons available. Yet in the battle and before he was captured, Sergeant Thompson destroyed 2 of those tanks. I asked him how he did it. He said, well, he jumped up on top and he knocked on the hatch, and when they opened the hatch, he threw a grenade down. And I said, Dennis, did the Army really teach you that? He said, no, I saw it in the John Wayne movie. Robbie Reisner's cellmate at the Hanoi Hilton wanted church services. The North Vietnamese camp commander refused and warned the room not to do it. They did it anyway. And their service was quickly caught in the eye of the authorities, and armed guards rushed into the room and broke up the church service with rifle butts. Reisner was led from the room, headed for months of solitary confinement and protracted physical abuse. As he was dragged out, the room burst into the Star-Spangled Banner. 6 adjoining rooms joined in. As Reisner struggled and marched out the door, his back straightened with pride, and he held his head high. After release, someone asked, how did it feel when they sang the national anthem? He said, I felt like I was 9 feet tall. 5 years ago, I was privileged to attend the unveiling of a statue to now General Robinson Reisner. The statue was presented to the Air Force Academy by H. Ross Perot. And Mr. Perot took great pleasure in unveiling what he called the life-size statue of Robbie Reisner. And it is 9 feet tall. Resistance to our captors was a given. And physical resistance was obviously pointless. Torture and brutality was so commonplace, they were routine. We were engaged in battle 24 hours a day. The rules of battle were simple, as they are simple today. Keep faith with your country. Keep faith with your fellow prisoners. Resist the enemy to the utmost of your ability. It was really that simple, and it really is that simple. Years after being saved from the ovens of Auschwitz by advancing Allied armies, Viktor Frankl wrote, "The one freedom we possess, and which can never be taken from us, is the capacity to determine what we will become in the next moment. We are free to choose whether to steal bread from our fellow beings or to share our bread with them. It is our good fortune to belong to a nation in which every individual is given a chance to discover his true worth, for good or ill, down to the last ounce of his character." You see, character does matter, and in the final analysis, perhaps character is all that matters. The POW experience taught the highest lessons of humanity, of truth and character, a duty to adhere to principles, a duty to your parents' memory, to your children's dreams, a duty to your country, a love for your Maker, and a profound gratitude for being allowed the privilege of walking through his creation. We have gathered here to honor the courage and sacrifice of our veterans in the defense of this nation and our heritage. The Chehalis Veterans Museum is an incredible testimony to the work and dedication of its staff and volunteers. It is a remarkable tribute to America's veterans. Yes, I stood beside my cousins on a street in Winlock. I was so proud I could scarcely draw a breath. I'm honored to be among you. I'm honored to be one of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the members of our museum, yeah, it's not working. Now, you got to turn it on? On behalf of the Board of Directors and members of this museum, we want to thank you not only for today, but for your lifelong service to this country. Thank you for a wonderful speech. Ed has indicated that he'd be willing to answer some questions from the audience if any chose to ask. So we'll take just a few minutes if you care to. I'd like to get him off his feet before we spend too long here. He's got two knees that are probably talking to him. Question right here. Were you flying out?
Now I'm on. Why don't you take that mic down where they can use it? And while you're doing that, I was asked recently by a newspaper reporter, how did you handle interrogations? I said, well, very simply, I very poorly lied about everything I said. And when they would catch me in a lie, I'd say, well, of course I'm lying to you. We're enemies. They never figure out how to handle that. And then I told the reporter, so when you write this story, keep in mind that I lied. Now, a question from the audience.
Just curious if you were flying out of play coup.
No. I was flying out of Udon, and our sister squadron was out of Pleiku. They were doing close air support. At Udon, we were doing rescue missions over North Vietnam.
Ed, would you introduce your wife and tell us about...
I met my wife, Suzanne. Please stand. I met my wife when we were 19. I was going to the Air Force Academy. She was attending school at the University of Hawaii. And as happens, although the first sparks of love were there, I say we were geographically undesirable. And we lost track of each other. I'd had a rather bad mission in Laos, lost a friend. They gave me some time off, so I went to Bangkok and spent a week trying to drink up all the adult beverages at the liquor store. Somewhere in that alcoholic haze, I wrote a letter to Suzanne at her parents' address. Well, I went back to combat, and 6 weeks or so later, came down with hepatitis. Watch out for those Chinese restaurants. Good food. And they moved me to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, and that's where an answer from Suzanne showed up. And it said, oh, we're in the same part of the world. If you ever get to the Philippines, look me up. I'm teaching first grade at the Department of Defense School at San Miguel Naval Communications Center. So I picked up the phone. By the time I was released to the hospital to go back, Suzanne and I were planning on getting married. And we were going to get together in late May, early June. And I took an extra mission so that I could spend some extra time with her. And as we were released from our alert and we were taxiing out to come home. And as we taxied out, the radio crackled, "Scramble the Sandys, streetcar 304 is down in Laos." So we launched to rescue streetcar. Well, it was a 3-day air battle. Had 7 American aircraft shot down. But we got streetcar out, and we got all the other pilots out except one. So I was missing in action for 5 years. Nobody knew where I was, what was going on. That was when they released the names of the prisoners to be released. I wasn't on the list. And Suzanne had a very, very good friend who'd been chasing her, trying to get her to marry him. I was gone, and so she did get married. 6 days before they released my name that I too was coming home. Well, regrettably, her marriage failed. And she tried to get a hold of me, only to learn from my sister that I'd just gotten married. Did you want a short answer to this question? Well, after my marriage failed, all right, that was the end of it. Until about 15 years ago, I was moving here to the Pacific Northwest, just as an old friend from the Philippine days called to tell me I might want to get a hold of Suzanne and give her some encouragement. She had breast cancer, and it was terminal. Phone calls, letters. As I came up, I swung by Placerville, California to see her. 6 months later, we were married at the Astor Column in Astoria. And at least so far, it's not terminal. And that basically is how Suzanne and I finally, after way too long a courtship, were married.
If my memory serves me correctly, I believe there was something that you kept telling your captors you were from East Tin Cup, Colorado, and that they found that you were from Winlock, Washington. How did they know that? How did they get connection that you were from Winlock?
I could only. Yeah, I used to tell them I was from East Tin Cup, Colorado. And of course, they tried to tell me that, well, your parents are grieving for you. And I told them, no, my parents died in an automobile accident. Told you I lied. And toward the end, they called me in and they went through. They said, you're from East Tin Cup, Colorado? Yes. Your parents died? Yes. And on and on and on. They said, you're lying. You're from Winlock, Washington, where your father practices law. I said, I told you I lied, and I paid for that. I have no idea. I assume that at that time the Soviets were running a fantastic clipping service. Anytime anybody's name appeared in the paper, if they were in the military, that was clipped out and mailed, and you had a dossier somewhere in the Kremlin. And that occurred for anybody who was in military service. I assume they got the information from the Soviets.
I think we'll close that part of the program right now, and we're going to move on to the next segment.
Thanks again.